everybody, and welcome to the Feminine Principle Podcast, Astrology for Authentic Living. My name is Mel with Energetic Principles.
And I'm Shawna with Neo Feminine Astrology.
And in this episode, we'll be discussing the astrology for the week of February 26th, 2018, and what we've titled, Let's Do the Work. So the purpose of this podcast is to give inspiration and guidance for this week with real-life examples of what to expect.
The three major aspects that we'll talk about today are Mercury square Mars and conjunct Venus, which is about beautiful projections. We'll also talk about the full moon in Virgo, which is about right timing. And we'll also talk about Venus and Mercury trine Jupiter, which is about loving what is. So as always, some of these aspects will influence you more than others based on what's actually happening in your life right now and your personal astrological makeup. So always notice what resonates with you most and use your intuition and logic to decide what's best for you.
Yes, because you know you best. So let's kick off this week's episode with a quick rundown of the moon's path to the zodiac. And some other minor aspects, although I think we have incorporated them all in today's episode. So let's stick to that moon for all you astro geeks out there. Well, our lunar lady starts off the week in her waxing cycle and at the tail end of Cancer before moving into loving Leo later on Monday. She remains in the land of the lion until late Wednesday when she moves into practical Virgo. She then heads to her full moon position on Thursday, which we'll talk about in much more detail later in the episode. She then carries on, now in her waning cycle, and into balancing Libra on Saturday, and where she'll remain throughout the weekend. So Shawna, share with us who we're featuring for this week's quotes.
So this episode features quotes and inspiration from the author and speaker Byron Katie. I chose her for this week for a few different reasons. Number one, she has a very Pisces kind of feel to her. She teaches this process of inquiry, which she calls the work. And it's very reflective. And there is a certain level of inquiry into the unconscious motives, but it's also very practical. And I find it very appropriate just for this week, also because we have a special announcement that we'll share with you in a second. So I'm happy to share her work with everyone.
Yes, and I had not heard of her before. I looked her up and started reading some of the things she has to say, and definitely some profound stuff for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're excited to jump into the transits with everyone. But we have, like I said, we have a special announcement. So bittersweet, exciting, but also sad at the same time. Mel and I will be dissolving the podcast in appropriate Pisces energy. Yeah, appropriate Pisces Neptune vibe. So we will be stopping the Feminine Principle podcast. We've decided to go separate ways for the purpose just of the podcast. And so stay tuned because neither of us are going anywhere, but just wanted to let everyone know that and to also express how much, I think I speak for both of us when I say how much we've enjoyed doing the podcast. It's been almost a year and it's just been a really fun and exciting journey. And I've learned a lot, so I know that for sure.
Yes. So
and excited
much.
for new things too. So, yeah.
Yes, so we definitely want you to keep abreast of what we're doing. So there's going to be a hiatus for a little bit. It could be a few weeks, could be a month or so. It could be, you don't know. So just keep in touch with what's going on. And this page will exist for a while as well. So there'll be updates once new things are on offer, so that you can see them as if you follow on Podbean or. Obviously, the patrons will take a different route, but we'll make announcements through this page so we can get everybody settled into some of the new things that we're doing that are probably going to be coming rather soon here. We got some retrogrades to work around, but they'll be out there soon. So just definitely, keep a lookout on our personal pages, me over at Energetic Principles and Shawna at Neo Feminine Astrology, and also on our Feminine Principle podcast page on Facebook and Instagram. We'll make announcements there too. So there's plenty of ways to get in touch with what we'll be doing next. And we promise it's going to be probably be different, but it's going to be exciting. And there'll be 2 things that you'll get to take advantage of each week instead of 1. So we're very thankful that you've been listeners for as long as you have, and the listenership keeps going up. And we're very grateful for that and all the people that have engaged with the podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And, Mel and I were, before we got on to record with everyone, we were just talking about the appropriateness of the timing and how we have this, which we'll talk about, the full moon in Virgo. And then we have that Venus-Neptune conjunction, which is like a new moon kind of period. And so in this way, it does feel like a sense of culmination and a sense of celebration, and then also something new, that Venus conjunct Neptune. And so I'm curious if anyone else is feeling, this, especially since we're after the eclipse season, that really changed things for each of us, for me and for Mel. And so I'm excited to share more with everyone as time goes on, and, everyone will get to see, what we're up to and all of that good stuff. But it's definitely been very interesting to see how things change over time, and excited for some new things to come as well.
Yes, because there's the one thing that is constant is change. So how appropriate for Pisces season, and excuse my French, a buttload of Neptune transits. Mm-hmm. I also noticed that we made it through half of a Mars cycle, which I thought was interesting. Started when Mars was in Gemini, and now that it's in Sagittarius, we're halfway through, which is so interesting because a lot of times when you make oppositions, even though they're oppositions, they're actually kind of a turning point in a way that starts a new cycle. So there's a lot of things that kind of lined up to this moment that, yes, is bittersweet. However, there's a lot of promise down the road, and it seems to definitely be inspired by the universe. So, yeah, we're just glad that you're with us here now, and we look forward to everybody, following us and where we're going down the road. So, with that being said, let's get into this week's and our final episode here. So let's do that work, Shawna. Okay, so our first segment we're going to talk about is Mercury, who is going to square Mars, that I was just talking about, and then conjunct Venus, and what we're titling Beautiful Projections. So some exacts on that, we have Mercury square Mars on Wednesday, February 28th at 3:56 p.m. Pacific time, which is 11:56 p.m. Universal time, and then Thursday, March 1st at 9:56 a.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that will happen at 20 degrees Pisces in Sagittarius. Then we have Mercury conjunct Venus on Sunday, March 4th at 10:06 a.m. Pacific Time, which is 6:06 p.m. Universal Time, and then Monday, March 5th at 4:06 a.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that will happen at 29 degrees Pisces. And then also note we have Mercury, who will be sextile to Pluto on Wednesday, February 28th at 8:40 p.m. Pacific Time, which is Thursday the 1st at 4:40 a.m. Universal Time, and then 2:40 p.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that sextile will happen at 20 degrees Pisces and Capricorn. So Shawna, kick us in with your first quote.
So this again is by Byron Katie. Since the beginning of time, people have been trying to change the world so that they can be happy. This hasn't ever worked because it approaches the problem backward. What the work gives us is a way to change the projector, the mind, rather than the projected. It's like when there's a piece of lint on a projector's lens, we think there's a flaw on the screen, and we try to change this person and that person, whomever the flaw appears on next. But it's futile to try to change the projected images. Once we realize where the lint is, we can clear the lens itself. This is the end of suffering and the beginning of a little joy in paradise. And so I chose this particular quote because Mercury square Mars, this is all about how it is that we view things, how it is that we're perceiving things at a more analytical level. And then Venus, there's this like, okay, how is it that we interact with people and how is it that we communicate, possibly project? And I think this is all kind of merged in with the fact that we have Neptune will be conjunct Venus as well. And when Mercury square Mars, there can be a little bit of internal tension because Mars is also about agitation and drive and setting boundaries and all of these things where there's like a fire inside of us. And so I think this week with Mercury, which is our mind squaring Mars, there's a bit of tension there and there may be a bit of agitation. And so it's I would encourage us, I like Byron's Katie approach of like, okay, instead of trying to fix the external situation, how do we work with how it is that we're perceiving things? How do we work with our own lens versus trying to change things that are happening outside of us? How do we work from the inside out?
I like that because, we're talking about, especially with Mercury square Mars, we're talking about, Pisces and Sagittarius energy. We're talking about challenging our mind to, the beliefs that drive us in a sense. And that kind of, it's basically our belief system that creates that lint that's on the lens, and if we are able to look at things in a new way, we're able to clear that lint. And I kind of like the way it's set up this week where we have Mercury square Mars first. And I think you're right about that, Shawna, like something might, we might be mentally agitated in some way or a little touchy, a little irritable, if certain challenges come our way or we have to communicate something that's a little difficult. Or we might be defending our ideas and our beliefs to other people, at this time. And so we just might find ourselves a little mentally irritated. But the beauty of this, I think, is because that Mercury is going to sextile Pluto at around the same time that it's going to square Mars, just slightly after. So I think we have an opportunity actually to get really in touch and go deeper with what it is that we're irritable about, what it is that we might need to be more honest with our beliefs and our visions and how we see things and how we ideally would like life to be. So I think that combination is going to be very fruitful to work through some kind of inner honesty and, maybe have a deep conversation with someone or with yourself. And work through some things. And then in turn, later on in the week, we have that Mercury conjunct Venus. So Mercury that, is going to get basically that new cycle of hopefully beauty of, that beautiful projection that we hope to see in life after we've kind of worked through a little bit of mental gunk that might be hanging about, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what I notice with people that have this kind of combination in their birth chart where it's Pluto and Mars and Mercury is that there is this tendency to run very hot when it comes with the mind and with the words. And it depends on the person's temperament. If that person is more of a fiery kind of energy, sometimes that can look like that person projecting more onto the outside and getting, when that person is like in something, they're really excited about it, and there's a lot of drive, for better or worse. They can be really excited, or when they get upset, it's very outwardly focused. Versus if that person has more of a watery nature, it's more internally focused. And so I think this week I would especially watch for, because it's involving Mercury and Mars and Pluto, I would definitely watch for how the dialogue is internally. What kinds of things are you saying to yourself about yourself and about other people? And going back to Byron Katie's work, is it a part of her work? The process is, if there's a story, if there's a thing that we're telling ourselves, number one, is it true? Number two, can you be sure that it's true? And then I think number three is like, is it helpful or something to that effect? Some of you that are familiar with her work will know the process more thoroughly, but it's like, yeah, is it actually true? And what kind of a emotional response are these stories creating inside of us? And I think that's good internal work for this week.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because if we look at that and adjust that within, that's really, as I think you've said before, Shawna, it's an inside job for sure. So that seems very appropriate, and we do have to keep in mind that Mercury is still in Pisces, so it's not necessarily that kind of aggressive energy that might go out. Like you were just saying, Shawna, with your own personal chart, that kind of depends upon your makeup and how you might interact with this. But as far as just the mundane transit for everyone, I think Mercury in Pisces, especially squaring Mars in Sagittarius, doesn't, so a lot of times that square comes up when we have to have a challenge. There's friction around something. There's a turning point. We have to develop in some way. And I think that mercurial function wants us to stay, somewhat decisive, honest, assert ourselves with that Mars energy. But Pisces is not necessarily that assertive. So I'm wondering if maybe there might be just tension on being able to focus on what is needed to tackle any problems, like resisting the mind's possible tendency to try to escape or to avoid or to procrastinate something, or to even stay out of conflict with each other. Because sometimes you have to have conflict because it's constructive conflict that then allows you to turn, to move through the turning point. So I guess that piece of advice personally would be just to, if you find yourself resisting or trying to avoid or procrastinate or be like, okay, if I just don't say anything, it'll all go away. You might want to rethink that because you might just have, especially with Mercury sextile Pluto, there just might be something that needs to be said, like some type of honesty or some type of truth is rising up and penetrating from below the surface. And we have to communicate that in some way, whether it's to another person or to ourselves internally.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So the last thing I'll say about this particular thing that I was noticing, Shawna, is that when we have Mercury, so basically all this is kind of happening while it's conjunct Chiron, while Mercury is conjunct Chiron. And so once again, we've talked about Chiron in the past and how that, sometimes that brings up some painful reminders of things, or gives us some sad memories, or brings up something that we just have to work through a little bit of pain in some way to kind of find ourselves on the healing end of things. And especially with Pluto being in the mix, I feel that this is an opportunity for something to come up that we can move through some, certain old things that might get us, find some compassion for ourselves and in turn for other people, and kind of move through certain pain if it arises. So, if we move through it and we face, whatever might come up at this time, then we can return to that joy and get us once again aligned with that, beautiful projection of what life could be. So, Shawna, do you have any thing about, that kind of Chiron energy, or working through some maybe painful things to end up on a more beautiful projection?
Yeah, so I don't use Chiron, so I won't speak to that, but I do find when Pluto is in the mix that it can be a bit tender and it can feel vulnerable, and sometimes that can be painful. I think the biggest thing with this, as far as it being a projection and returning to that beautiful projection, when I think of beautiful projection, I think of the fact that we're always projecting our view onto other people. It's impossible to be entirely objective. And so I think a part of this combination, the Mercury square Mars, conjunct Venus, and then Pluto being in there in the mix as well, is that we can become consciously aware of how it is that we project onto people and what we see in people. And this doesn't mean that we force something onto someone, but it means that we see certain characteristics in people that we want to see. And maybe sometimes they're there, maybe sometimes they're not. But I definitely see this as, definitely a tender time, a more vulnerable time where we're working out some things that maybe, where there was hurt in the past. And I think that the more that we can become aware of how it is that the story is going in our minds and how that creates different things, like this always happens this way, or whenever I get into this situation, that happens, that kind of internal dialogue. I think the more that we can be aware of the fact that we actually have that dialogue, then that's when we can take more ownership of the projections that we place onto people.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice, especially when we're working with Pisces. Not everything is that clear, and there is kind of a, an ideal lens that goes over what it is that we're seeing. And it's the perfect time to move through and transition, especially while all these planets are in mutable signs, because that is kind of, it's the energy that allows you to kind of move through change, close down, start up. And so I feel that this is a good opportunity actually to help us align with those, with a kind of a new way of viewing things. So that being said, let's talk about the tarot cards, because I think that there seems to be a theme this week, as you'll see, as I'm sure it's a theme with the podcast, but it's also just a theme in general. And so I drew Death as the focus and the Queen of Pentacles as the grounding. And so here we are once again moving through some sort of change. We're transitioning. We are rebirthing in a way. And we're doing so in the realm of Queen of Pentacles. Pentacles are our ambitions, how we bring abundance into our lives, and kind of good fortune in general, and where it is we devote ourselves to, and what it is that we're realistic about, what makes us feel secure. And so I think that there's a lot of things changing this week in realms with that, where we're going to be closing down old areas of life that don't really support our true ability to be abundant in life. And by kind of closing down those things and then embracing what's next and around the corner, and that, that new opportunity for new life, essentially, I think that, by kind of stepping into this unknown and working through this Pisces season, we're basically setting us up for good fortune down the road. I think. So Shawna, what do you think about Death and Queen of Pentacles coming together?
Yeah, so I think it's very appropriate, given that this is our last episode, the last episode of the Feminine Principle. The Death card is, I like to say that it's often a very negatively viewed card, but it's actually one of my favorites secretly, because it really does signal a time of change. It signals that it's time to allow things to fall away, so that there can be new birth, so that there can be new life. And I think of the Death card as coming at a very sacred time, because it's different than the Devil card. The Devil card is like, oh, there's like resistance here and that kind of thing. But the Death card is there's almost this like peaceful sense of allowing the process of life to happen. And there is death in life. There's that constant cycle of, things dying and falling away and decomposing. And then that allows for the fertilization of new life. And so, yeah, I think it's appropriate for this episode. And then the Queen of Pentacles is like, yes. And then there's new earth to be had. Like there's something new that's being created as well, and something quite beautiful. And, it reminds me, Mel, of kind of like what we were talking about before we got on to record, is that a big part of, each of us may share more of this as time goes on. But a big part of why the podcast is ending is that we have we're finding that we have different approaches, and that in order for each of us to thrive, that we each need to step into our own personal approach and our own personal voice. And in order for that to happen at this point in time, that means that something needs to dissolve. And so, so I wonder if that's happening for anyone else that's listening, because there's a reason that you're listening to this. If you're listening, so yeah, I would imagine that at this point in time for all of us, that there is something that is falling away, something that's dissolving, especially following the eclipse season where things have changed. And then I see the Queen of Pentacles also, again, as encouragement that it's okay, that there will be, like, there's always more, and there's always new birth after the death and after the falling away of something.
Absolutely. And, last thing I'll say about the Queen of Pentacles, and especially in relation to the Death card, is that the Queen of Pentacles, there's a nurturing theme there. And so I'm thinking that, especially in the Pisces season, one of the most important things about Pisces is developing compassion. And it's not just compassion for what you see around you. It's inner compassion. And so I'm thinking that part of this Queen of Pentacles energy, as we focus around the changes that are happening in life right now, is that we can, bring out a greater sense of security within us by practicing compassion, and especially inner compassion as we move through changes. And by doing so, then we set ourselves up for greater security down the road. So I think these are two beautiful cards together, I'd have to say, Shawna, and they definitely represent our situation, but I think it obviously represents the situation for the whole week and what's going on. And you'll see that as we go on to our next segment here shortly, but it doesn't stop here. All right, so some questions to take away for Mercury square Mars and also conjunct Venus and Pisces. I would ask myself, how does my mind view my reality? Am I only focused on what is wrong outside of me? Can I take the time to honestly look within and see what needs to be changed on the inside to project the beauty I want to see on the outside? I would ask, as we embrace the nature of transition that Pisces season brings, how well am I moving through change? Can I step into the unknown with the hope of good fortune around the corner? And then lastly, I would ask, is there a conversation that I need to have with a loved one, or perhaps even with myself? Can I communicate from a place of compassion to say what needs to be said in order to move into a balanced new beginning?
Nice.
All right, so let's move on to our next segment here, and something that's probably most important during the week, and that is that full moon in Virgo that we'll be having, and what we're titling Right Timing. And so some exacts on that, we have our full moon on Thursday, March 1st at 4:51 p.m. Pacific time, which is Friday the 2nd at 12:51 a.m. Universal time, and then 10:51 a.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that's going to happen at 11 degrees Virgo. And then also note, we have the sun who's going to conjunct Neptune and will be a part of this lunation. And that conjunction will happen exactly on Sunday, March 4th at 5:55 a.m. Pacific time, which is 1:55 p.m. Universal time, and then 11:55 p.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that conjunction will happen at 14 degrees Pisces. So Shawna, kick us in with your next quote.
So this again is from Byron Katie. I love not rushing the process. Mind doesn't shift until it does. And when it does shift, it's right on time. Not 1 second too late or too soon. People are just like seeds waiting to sprout. We can't be pushed ahead of our own understanding. And so I liked this for the full moon in Virgo because Virgo is all about improvement. It's about this process of becoming better always, and the sense of healing that can come from that at a heart level, but then also at a practical level, that things just work better. And I think that because this is a full moon, in Virgo, we may be feeling that rush towards the process, that rush to shift, that rush to improve and to have things all figured out. And it just seems like a really beautiful reminder to say, okay, no, it's okay. You know, we essentially have a full moon conjunct Neptune. And so this adds another layer of like, we want to be really practical and figure out the process, the Virgo process, but then there's a little bit of confusion or a little bit of haze also as well. So I think that it's wise during this time to embrace both of those, to know that there is a process that we're working through and that it's right on time and it will happen organically. The pieces will click into place when it is time.
Yeah, that definitely, Virgo can sense when it's time, I think, and it can know when to wait too. And that's the beauty of Virgo, is it has that decisive discernment, and is able to kind of read that energy in a practical way. And especially since we have this full moon in opposition to Neptune in the sun, I think we're going to get a lot. I feel like this is one of the moons of the year that we have kind of that reality check of life in some way. And especially since we're moving through all this Pisces energy, we have the sun conjuncting Neptune. And so, you know, much in flavor of what we've been talking about this whole episode, and the idea of, like, you know, dissolving the podcast and how a lot of things are just falling away from our lives right now, but are doing so in order to make to allow us to transition into something else. And I think that this full moon is going to allow us to get kind of a more practical consciousness around what is happening, what's apexing, and what it is we're releasing. And, you know, it's happening at 11 degrees Virgo, and in Witeki system, 11 degrees is what I become. And the idea of Pisces is, you know, what we sense in that kind of vision and that more, watery, dreamy type of realm. And so I have a feeling we're going to be kind of apexing in a way, in a practical way, to fully understand what it is we are becoming, now that we're shifting through all this energy and moving into new space, and especially for Aries season, that's just right around the corner. So we're kind of in this in-between zone, and I feel like this full moon is really going to help us, you know, just get a little more practical about where we are right now, and maybe even enjoy that for a moment. Let me just take this in, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it, you know, typical full moon fashion, it is a time of culmination. It is a time, but also, you know what I was thinking too, is that this is the first lunation that we're having outside of the eclipse season too. And so I think that because of the practicality of Virgo, we may become much more clear on all of the things that happened in the last month or so. Especially around the times of the lunar eclipse on January 31st and then the solar eclipse on February 15th. The details, the reasoning, the why, all of those Virgo things, those may be illuminated now that we have a little more space away from the nodes and from the eclipse season.
Yeah, that can definitely be something that comes up, because, you know, when Virgo is here, we can get real about something. Like we can, you know, kind of touch reality a little bit more and fully understand that. And I think that can be a very valuable thing, especially when we're moving through Pisces energy and we're moving through all these Neptune transits, because we might get a little off course or start to not see things as, you know, as realistically as we could. And so I don't know, I feel that this full moon is very valuable, and it is out of the eclipse season, but in some ways I feel it isn't, because you know, when we have a new moon and we just have that new moon solar eclipse, it kind of sets the tone, it sets the stage to what is going to then in turn be released at that full moon. Even though the full moon has different aspects that have going on, you know, we're continuing a story. And it's the idea of rising to something and rising to that release. So even though it's might be technically not in eclipse season. A part of it is, there will be a culmination within that, what we were feeling at that solar eclipse. And in turn, that solar eclipse was, a starting point for what we were feeling at that lunar eclipse that you were just referencing, Shawna, on the 31st of last month. So I do think this plays a part of our story for sure. And I find it very interesting, Shawna, because I like the Sabian symbols and everything. And I found this a very appropriate Sabian symbol, especially for Virgo energy. And so for 12 degrees Virgo, the symbol is a bride with her veil snatched away. And I was like, that's interesting. And so the key word is invitation, and the theme is a moment of truth. And what Diana Roche says in her book is she talks about how this theme speaks to discovery, but also accountability and the idea of a truth coming to light. And for some reason, that seemed to fit so well in my mind with the full moon in Virgo, and kind of that, reality check, discernment type of energy where now we're like, oh, wait. I understand what this is. I understand. I'm starting to put together why I am where I am right now, and what all this is leading to. And so there just seems to be something that is going to come to light during this full moon that helps us really get the truth of just where we're at right now. And that kind of speaks a lot to a lot of the Pluto transits that we're having this week. We have some Pluto sextiles we talked about in the prior episode, segment with Mercury sextile Pluto, but I think we have Venus sextile Pluto, which we'll talk about in the next segment as well. And so, it's interesting, Shawna. What do you think about the bride with her veil snatched away, and the idea of discovery and a moment of truth?
Yeah. So, a few different thoughts about that. Okay, yeah. So I don't particularly resonate with that Sabian symbol for some reason, but except for the one piece about the truth, that definitely I can definitely apply that to this moon in Virgo, because Virgo is about the facts. It's about questioning things. I have several friends with their moon in Virgo, and they ask all of the questions. They're very interested in the truth and what is actually happening. What is the reality of this situation? And so, so I resonate with that. The other piece that I think is really interesting too is, as far as tying this back to the eclipse cycle, I think that, I could see how you would look at, within the lunar cycle, this being a culmination of the solar eclipse, the new moon on February 15th. And at the same time, the lunar cycle, it's separated from a whole sign of the north and south node, which is what creates the eclipses. And so I think the fact that that we're in this earthy moon now, and that there is this separation from that point of darkness that the eclipses create, there is this certain sense of being able to question things now, being able to stand outside of that dark void that happens when there is an eclipse. And so, that's what I think about that.
Yeah. And well, I pick up what you're putting down, especially that Virgo. It's funny how you have a bunch of Virgo moon friends. It makes sense because you have that Virgo rising. And actually, that's how we're tying it into the podcast here, because this full moon actually falls on Shawna's ascendant, and then it also falls on my Saturn too. So we kind of have that synastриc point there. Yes, everything is culminating here. But what I'll just leave y'all with what Diana said for her, kind of opportunity versus the risk in her vision of the symbol. And she said the opportunity is to verify things for yourself and to check out claims before relying on representations. So if things are coming to light and you're discovering things, in Virgo fashion, go through them, make sure what you're seeing is the truth, and that all the facts, check out, as you were just saying, Shawna, what's the facts here? And then the risk is to guard against impatience or ripping the chrysalis from the cocoon too soon, because she speaks of, because part of this, she likens to, the positive side is integrity and giving of oneself to their commitments and the commitments that we make in life, which is so interesting. Falling on my Saturn personally, I'm like, wait, this is really speaking to me. So just a couple things there. But before we move on to these tarot cards, let's talk about that sun that's going to conjunct Neptune real quick and how that kind of plays into this lunation. Because we have our yearly transit, the sun, once a year, the sun will always conjunct to Neptune and kind of, we start that dreamy, inspirational cycle, but also a cycle that is, dissolves things in our life to begin to start new things and get us more aligned with, our spirit in a way, or at least that's the way I like to look at it. So Shawna, what do you think about the sun conjuncting Neptune and just how it might play into this whole full moon?
Yeah, so what I think about this, so a few different things. The sun conjunct Neptune, it is this new cycle around our awareness of the mystical, our awareness of the subtle energy that we can feel. And this transit, for people that have Pisces energy in general, people that are having a Neptune transit in general, it's going to be more prominent. But for all of us, it is this time when we can connect more to the ethereal energy, to feeling the energy in the room, to sensing things. And we can be more impressionable as well. And so I actually like that this conjunction of Neptune and the sun is happening on a full moon, because in a way that combats that the disillusionment, the problematic side of the sun and Neptune. The problematic side of the sun and Neptune can be a tendency to be influenced by other people, so that a person could even like take on someone's viewpoint when maybe that isn't the best thing, or to be like there's even a certain element of codependence that can come up with this kind of combination. And it depends, everyone's different, but I like that it's happening with the full moon in Virgo, because I think that really balances out those tendencies to be heavily influenced by someone else, so that we may be feeling and more connected to the subtle energies, but then we have our feet on the ground at the same time.
I like that, Shawna, because the sun moves at its daily pace, and so we've been approaching this conjunction for a little while now, and maybe we have found ourselves, in that kind of impressionable zone, or merging in a way that we kind of maybe lose some sight of our own personal truths, or what have you. But the fact that we have this full moon in Virgo can bring us back. And much like that Sabian symbol I was just talking about, discovery and a moment of truth coming to light. And so perhaps part of that full moon in Virgo, in its way, when it's, battling that sun and Neptune conjunction, is, we are going to be more, get a more realistic view, or something that just we might have taken for granted, or just assumed because other people assume it, or our partnerships are this way or the other. We might get that reality boost. Something just comes out, and we're more practical about that. And we're like, maybe I don't believe that. Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm surrendering myself too much to another person. Or there's a part of my own ego that needs to surrender a little bit in order for me to, get what it is that I really want in life, and to become this more, because the Virgo energy wants us to be, get organized, be conscious about our health, have a practicality to our life. What do our details and our routines look like? Have we been neglecting them during this Pisces season and all the Neptune, it just pulls us back to this reality, I think. And especially in relation to, who we are, our partnerships and our relation to the public, because, a full moon, and moon in opposition, the sun to begin with, any opposition usually represents, something outside of us, or another person, or the world, or a shadows aspect of ourself, which is usually represented by another person, or something along those lines. So I think we're going to be getting some clarity there, and kind of just coming back to earth a little bit after all this Pisces action.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about those tarot cards for this full moon. And surprise, surprise, we have death again as the focus. And then the Page of Swords as the grounding, which was interesting in the last segment, Shawna, when you were talking about you had a musing that was kind of along these two lines with these two characters together, and that Page of Swords, that kind of decisive energy. And so I like this combination together. So once again, we're tackling death and the idea of, transforming our lives in some way, and to change and to close down an old cycle to begin a new one. And part of it, having the Page of Swords there is the Page of Swords is ready to tackle, a challenge, is ready to take action. It's if a conflict comes its way, it's prepared to deal with it. And it's got this youthful idealism to it. But at the same time, it's raring and ready to go. So part of me thinks on the highest side of, this Page of Swords energy is that we're ready to tackle the change in our life. We're ready. We've moved through enough things now that it's like, okay, let's get on with this. Let's start a new cycle. And whatever I come up against, that's okay, because I'm going to work through it and get myself out on the other side. So, Shawna, how do you see death and the Page of Swords coming together?
Yeah, so anytime a card comes up more than once in a reading, it's definitely worthy of note. Mm-hmm. Sure. And so, I think it's really interesting that we have the double combination of the death card with a card that represents movement and action. And we had that with the Death and the Queen of Pentacles previously, and now we have the Death card with the Page of Swords. And so, this says to me that there is, more emphasis on something being transmuted, something changing. The Death card also makes me think of the process of alchemy as well, and how something is changed from one form into another. Death does not mean the end. It means something is being changed. And the Page of Swords is really interesting because there is this certain element of excitement and ambition and action. And so it's like, what is it that something's falling away, but then there's like an oomph, there's almost an excitement about it. And so, the problematic side of the Page of Swords, of course, is being hasty. And so that's something that I would watch out for. I don't know that we'll be hasty necessarily because we have so much Pisces energy. But I would feel into that and see how that feels. And depending on the amount of motivation, we can lean into what's exciting versus trying to just make things happen. This to me feels like, okay, what's inspiring, and to focus on that, the inspiration, versus just trying to move the process forward, to focus on the excitement.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And it's interesting, Shawna, because we have to keep in mind with this full moon in Virgos, the day prior we have Mercury square Mars. And so that there's going to be a little bit of a flavor to that. And we were talking about in the previous segment, the possibility of maybe a little touchiness, maybe a little irritability in some ways. And to be honest, the Page of Swords can be, it's got that independent quality to it. So, with certain independent thinking, when we're dealing with other people, and especially in a full moon, once again, it's an opposition. So we might be dealing with other people in all this, accepting the views of others, or being in certain petty quarrels, or irritable, or being difficult just for the sake of it. But I think if we kind of move through that approach, and instead, rather than being that, let me just resist this, or let me, be irritable about this, or let's stay vigilant about what it is that we are, where it is that we're changing, and just the new, what is new that is coming along the way. Because if we stay that excitement, we keep that excitement with where it is we're transitioning, we remain vigilant. And vigilant is rooted in the Latin word to keep awake. And so if we keep our eyes open, and then we acknowledge certain truths, which is interesting because once again, that Sabian symbol, we're talking about a moment of truth or a truth coming to light. And if we keep our emotional fears out of it, because, in Pisces, sometimes emotions take over and then we just don't feel like we can handle anything. We don't feel like we can cope with the world and it's just all too much. And so if we can just remain vigilant through change and just stay, as they say, woke in a way, we're going to be able to kind of start a new cycle regardless of what conflict we might engage in and stay excited for it, because what's around the corner it's most likely the best thing that we've encountered yet. We just have to stay open to it. So... all right, so some questions to take away for this full moon in Virgo. I would ask myself, what truths are coming to light with this full moon? Is there something that is being discovered that must now be accounted for? Will I verify and check out all claims before representing that discovery? I would ask, with the full lunation being a time of release, what is it that needs to be let go and surrendered from my life? And what is it that I sense I am now becoming? And then lastly, I would ask, is there anywhere in my life that I need to remain vigilant? As I move through shifting sands, will I keep my eyes open, acknowledge the truth of what I see, and keep any emotional fears out of it?
Nice.
All right, so let's move on to our final segment here, and that is Venus and Mercury, both in Pisces, who will be in a trine to Jupiter in Scorpio, and what we're titling Loving What Is. And so some exacts on that, we have Venus trine Jupiter on Thursday, March 1st at 3:22 a.m. Pacific time, which is 11:22 a.m. Universal time, and then 9:22 p.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that will happen at 23 degrees Pisces and Scorpio. Then we have Mercury trine Jupiter on Friday, March 2nd at 5:05 a.m. Pacific time, which is 1:05 p.m. Universal time, and then 11:05 p.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that will also happen at 23 degrees Pisces and Scorpio. And just of note, we have one minor aspect, and that is Venus, who will be sextile to Pluto on Tuesday, February 27th at 2:17 a.m. Pacific time, which is 10:17 a.m. Universal time, and then 8:17 p.m. Aussie Eastern Standard Time. And that will happen at 20 degrees Pisces and Capricorn. So Shawna, kick us in with your last quote.
So this quote is from Byron Katie. Life is simple. Everything happens for you, not to you. Everything happens at exactly the right moment, neither too soon nor too late. You don't have to like it. It's just easier if you do. And so I liked this for this particular combination because I have a sense that there's something that happens where it may be easier for us to like the situation. There's a sense of ease that comes in when we have Venus, which is our capacity to relate to other people, and then Mercury, which is our mental capacity, in this harmonious trine aspect to Jupiter, which is about expansion and luck and optimism. And because this combination is in water signs, it's in Pisces and Scorpio, there is a certain level of depth and intensity, but I think this adds a little bit of maybe something sweet or something optimistic, or a little rainbow around something that may be challenging. Like it makes me think of this little rainbow around whatever the Mercury square Mars energy, that agitation that we've been having. And so that's what I'm feeling for this aspect.
Yeah, I can see that as well. Especially because we didn't even address Shawna in the last segment about the full moon in Virgo and how Virgo is ruled by Mercury, and so Mercury is kind of taking a front seat to this week a little bit with driving some of this action, I think. And I think it's all going to start out when it's almost like it all kind of begins to culminate a little bit when we have Mercury sextile Pluto and then Venus sextile Pluto. So we are able to kind of work with that energy, or we have the opportunity to work with the idea of change and how this change is most likely beneficial for us. Like you were saying, you know, hope to put like a rainbow around it. Like, let's look at how this is, you know, because this is a trine. It's trying to move us as seamlessly as possible and harmoniously as possible into this new realm of the future, and Jupiter being in Scorpio. And we've seen it time and time again with each podcast we've done when we have these Jupiter aspects, especially in Scorpio, ever since it's been there for the last, I think, 4 months or so. There's always an element of change when something's contacting Jupiter in Scorpio. It's like, okay, it's time to dive these depths. It's time to, you know, renew this cycle in some way. And even with the trine there. So I think you're definitely right about that. You know, like how can we look at this, this week as really setting ourselves up to be more in line with the growth that we're trying to facilitate in our lives. And it might not be easy as we work through some Mercury and some squaring Mars, because when the moon is in Virgo as well, you know, when it midweek, like Thursday, Friday, you know, the moon's going to square Mars, but it's going to sextile Jupiter. So all this kind of action that's getting kicked up and this like intensity that we might feel is all getting us so that we can be like, okay, it's time to move on. It's time to change, and it's time to embrace, you know, what the future looks like next. And I think with Venus trine Jupiter, part of that is getting us aligned with, you know, what it is our heart's desire. What do we feel most comfortable with opening up to? What are we inspired by, especially with Venus being exalted in Pisces right now? And then Mercury is, you know, learning from the whole thing. It's like a learning experience for our growth. And we're getting more in touch with what it is our personal philosophy is right now, I think. And then all that hanging out with Pluto is really a healing opportunity. So yeah, I'm wondering how that, I'm wondering what you think, Shawna, about, you know, just Mercury this whole week, and, you know, tying into that full moon we were just talking about and how it's, you know, aligning itself with this growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's interesting because Mercury, it's essentially sandwiched between Venus and Neptune, and in the sign of Pisces. And I don't know, Mercury in the sign of Pisces and surrounded by these planets that are more about feminine energy and receptive energy in general, it doesn't say that to me that we're necessarily having the strongest analytical capacity. It is more about envisioning things and envisioning the ideal and having lots of ideas, and maybe all of those ideas are very imaginative and very creative, and not necessarily rooted in, you know, the practical application right at this moment. I think that we may have a little bit of that because there's the full moon in Virgo. But I think even though there is the focus on the thinking mind and Mercury, it's definitely more about the imagining mind than anything. And so, you know, I think that's classic Pisces season anyways. And so I think that the feeling tone is that we're having a lot of ideas and we're very inspired, and it's a good time to let those things percolate. It's a good time to allow, as Mercury goes through the entire sign of Pisces, to allow things to percolate. And then it's interesting, Mercury will get just into the sign of Aries, and then it will go retrograde back into Pisces. So we may be having lots of ideas that we go back over again once we get to March and April.
Yeah, that's definitely something that can come up. And I like what you're saying about the whole, you know, letting those ideas percolate right now, because there's a lot of creativity that goes along while we're hanging out in Pisces. And with it trining Jupiter, we're more likely to, you know, get in touch with certain creative processes that, or just inspiration that might help direct us is to where we're headed and what it is we see ourselves going to in the future. And because we are going to be hitting Mercury retrograde here in a little bit. We have to have, whenever Mercury retrograde shows up, we have to have something to chew over, right? So I'm thinking that a lot of these things that are setting us up for these, new creative ideas and new growth directions, we get to then kind of like, sit with it and think about that a little bit. But I do have to say, when we do have this Mercury retrograde, it's kind of retrograde. I think it retrogrades in Aries, and it doesn't make it back to Pisces. It stops at 5 degrees Aries. So it's a lot of Aries going on here, but that doesn't mean that we're not considering what's going on, before all this. I think it's going to be a very fruitful retrograde, actually, especially with all the solar eclipse energy and the lunar eclipse and everything that's happened in the last couple months. So we'll just speak to it ahead of time a little bit here, since we probably won't be speaking about it when it happens. But yeah, it's around the corner for sure. But, I think these aspects are kind of the saving grace for the week, Shawna. Just this flow, it's like the universe wants us. It's like, we want to heal you. We want to get you into, this new harmonious flow of, what it is that you love to do, and, stimulate the mind to move on to new things and just, embrace new direction in life. So I like these trines personally.
Yeah, it definitely says that there's something there for us, that there's a gift, there's some kind of resource that we have that and something that may just be that may come in spontaneously, something that may actually figuratively or literally be handed. Yeah.
And that's interesting too, because once these trines happen, and then Mercury and Venus conjunct later in the week, and what we talked about in that first segment is they're going to conjunct at 29 degrees Pisces, and so we're going to have they're going to come together on a tested degree, and I have a feeling we're going to just, our minds and our kind of just. Our hearts are going to align in some way, and what it is that we desire. And I think we're actually going to get some solid clarity probably at that moment. We might be tested on it. We might have to be compassionate about what it is that we're thinking or, opening up to in a way. But I have a feeling by the end of the week, Sunday, early Monday, we're going to start to feel one with that. And those trines will come out even more. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the tarot cards I drew for these trines happening. And I got the Queen of Swords as the focus, and then the Empress as the grounding. And I found these very interesting, Shawna, because here we have the image of one woman who is a little bit more kind of cold and calculated, logical and decisive, tells it like it is, that Queen of Swords. And then we have this woman who is warm and compassionate and nurturing. And so I found it very interesting, kind of the difference in this energy, and having to find the balance between, that kind of logical, astute version of ourselves, and then that creative and nurturing version. And that ultimately we have to kind of balance both out, especially later in the week. I believe we have the moon in Libra. Is the moon in Libra, I think? The moon's going to be in Libra later on in the week. So we're going to be trying to balance things anyways as we move after this full moon. And so I'm thinking that for, our ultimate growth in this situation, it's like, how do we, stay practical, logical, realistic, and then also, but how do we involve that creativity and nurturing all that into that? So in turn, the Queen of Swords can also kind of not address its own emotional needs too. And so I'm wondering if part of this is we can still nurture other people or still nurture what it is we're working on, but sometimes, in true Virgo fashion, we have to say no to something in order for that to happen, and be more decisive instead of always giving the Empress. So that's just kind of one facet of it. And so I noticed that balance is just interesting per se. But Shawna, what do you think about Queen of Swords and the Empress?
Yeah, so I think it is interesting the polarity of the feminine that is more logical and analytical, which is the Queen of Swords, and then the feminine that is softer and more spontaneous and playful, which is the Empress. And I think it's interesting because I think that it does speak to the fact that towards the end of the week, over the weekend, we're having two conjunctions that are exact. We're having the Sun Neptune, which we talked about, and then the Mercury Venus, which we've talked about. And I think this is kind of cool because it's like Mercury Venus makes me think of the Queen of Swords, that the keen mind within the feminine energy, the feminine that is still about creation, but more from an analytical level. And then we have the Sun Neptune, which is about the feminine that is about creation, but in a more more receptive way. There's more spontaneous creation versus strategic creation. And so I'm wondering if we may be feeling a little bit of both of those. And like you say, Mel, we may be wanting to balance out each sides of ourselves. And I just really love the Empress as the final card as well. I think it's such a promising card. The Empress, it's such an encouragement to birth something that's being, for like something new that is coming. And it seems very appropriate that we've had the Death card, and now the Empress. So it's like that the new beginning, the new life is ready to be created, to see the world.
Mm. And all those queens too, that it seems like there's the kind of a nurturing energy on many different levels to kind of move us through this change. And so, yeah, I like that a lot too. And I guess the last thing I would say about these two cards together, because the Empress is all about, that compassionate and that nurturing nature. And if I were to look at, Virgo and Pisces polarity here, Virgo sometimes focuses on perfection. And the Queen of Swords can fall into that sometimes, where it just wants it to be this particular way, or I see it this way, or that this would be perfect, So I guess, how can we balance in ourselves and be more realistic about our ideal of perfection? Because Virgo kind of has that kind of perfection energy, which lives in the ideal. Pisces likes ideals just in general. And so I'm wondering, how we can embrace more of that Empress's, compassionate, nurturing energy and that nature that is essentially Pisces in a lot of ways. So yeah, let's just move through any type of judgment or like disruption of an ideal through just nurture ourselves. We'll get through it and find ourselves growing on the other end. So. All right, so some questions to take away for Venus and Mercury, who will be in a trine to Jupiter. I would ask myself, what brings me simple pleasure in life? Am I grateful for what surrounds me and loving what is? And if not, how can I open my mind to bring more of that simple joy in my life? I would ask, how focused am I on perfection? Do I need to be more realistic about my ideals? Can I find room for compassion within the seemingly imperfect? And then lastly, I would ask, with the opportunity to heal ourselves this week, will I wear my heart's desire on my sleeve and communicate to those around me how I honestly feel? By aligning with what I truly value, can I set the course for a positive future? So, Shawna, what did we learn? What have we learned through this whole experience?
We've learned a lot.
Learned so much. Well, in this week in particular, we've learned that it's time to do the work. And Mercury is going to square Mars and conjunct Venus, and we're getting aligned with, our beautiful projections in life. And if what it is we're projecting out into the world is the image we want to see, how we might be able to change that. We learned that we have a full moon in Virgo and the timing is right. We're going to be getting a little more practical and brought down to earth a little bit and balance out some of this Pisces energy. And then lastly, we learned that Venus and Mercury both are going to trine Jupiter. And it's time to love what is and get on board with where we're growing in life and follow that road and do so in a sense, with a sense of nurturing and compassion for what it is that we are currently going through. So Shawna, I know you have an excellent action item to share with our peeps, so please share.
Yeah, so because this week there's such an emphasis on endings and beginnings in so many different ways, the tarot cards and the transits, and personally for Mel and I, this is an ending and a beginning, and so I want us to embrace this with the action item. So I want you to journal on two different things: what it is that is in transition, what it is that's ending, what it is that's falling away. And this can be something very literal, or it can just be the ending of a way of being. It can be the ending of feeling a certain way or thinking about things a certain way. And then the second thing is, what is it that is emerging? What is it that that's percolating? What is it that you're gestating? One other thing that we didn't mention at the beginning that I thought was interesting is we'll be at about 9 months for the podcast, which is the gestation period. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. Come to terms. So so that's part of the action item as well, is it's like, yeah, what's come to terms, so to speak. And what is it what's the new gestation? So both of those things, do a little reflection on that.
I love that, Shawna, because that really plays into the Empress energy, and it also plays in the energy of death, because when something comes to term, it obviously, and how people, when they have babies, men and women, a lot of times there's this sense of loss afterwards, because it's time. In order to move into a new cycle, we basically have to honor what it is that falls away and that portion, and starting a new chapter of our lives. So I like that. I find that very appropriate for this week and all the symbols that we've had. So, yeah, it might be a bittersweet podcast in the end, but I think that all the aspects kind of lined up to it. And yeah, I got a lot out of personally just recording this podcast right now as I'm thinking about things. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I like this. I like where this is going. So yeah. Now, of course, this will be the last time we'll speak to you in this realm or this area. But we do want you to know where you can find us once again, just so that we are able to keep the conversation alive and share with you what we are doing in the future. So you can find me over at energeticprinciples.com. And you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Energetic Principles. And I have daily guidance up there for, my stories. And I also offer readings. And there's a lot of different things going on right now. So if you want to check that out or just reach out, you know where to find me. So Shawna, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me under Neo Feminine Astrology on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And like Mel said, definitely all of the things that I'm working on, stay tuned. You can follow me there, and I'll keep you updated.
Yes, absolutely. And, just because we're not going to do the podcast anymore doesn't mean that we don't support each other fully. So we are here to we're both doing great things in the world, and it's best that we, even though we're separating in other things, if anything, it's like a cell that divides, right, Shawna? We're dividing this cell into two separate growths that are just going to, go beyond what this is, and in turn just support each other and support everybody out there that's doing these types of things and sharing their light with other people. And then everybody that's listening that wants to become part of that, part of that energy. And that's why it is we do what we do, Shawna, right? Yeah,
definitely. It is all about connection.
All about connection. So we're still here to connect.
Yeah, it's very much about connection and relationships. And my hope is that, that we all get to experience, there's always endings and beginnings in relationships, and things are not always clean and neat and tidy. And, that's how it's been a little bit with the podcast. And that's real life. And that's what I think each of us really want to reflect is, we're going through the process with everyone of all, the day-to-day stuff. And so, yeah, so that's...
we are not exempt. We are not exempt. So absolutely. I second that for sure. All right. Well, Shawna, any last words for our listeners?
Yeah, just sending lots of love. And I want to say thank you to everyone for listening and for the support and the kind words. And it's always such a joy to hear from everyone, to hear that you like the podcast, to hear that you got something out of it. And it just makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. And so I appreciate you. Thank you for listening and for being here. And thank you for, doing your thing in the world too. That's important as well.
Yes, we all make a difference in our own way. And I totally second everything you just said, Shawna. Mm-hmm. Very grateful for all our listeners. Very grateful for what we were able to build and in such a short time too. And that is priceless on many levels. And the buck doesn't stop here. The buck is just changing currency right now. Mm-hmm. So keep on the lookout and we'll continue our journeys together. So wishing you a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you shortly. So thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, may the stars be with you.
Namaste.